Welcome to Thriller Recaps. Today, I am explaining the movie, Inside Man, explaining every scene as it happens. Watch till the end, and please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy this. The movie started with a van driving through the streets, with the people inside covered from head to toe. They were pretending to be a painting company. The van stopped at the Manhattan Trust Bank, where people went about their usual activities. One of the people from the van stylishly disabled the CCTV cameras. A bank manager noticed their sneaky behavior and asked what was going on, giving the robbers the chance to pull out their guns and order everyone to lie flat on the floor. They were armed robbers. They threw tear gas into the bank, which made the commotion even worse. A police officer outside saw the smoke coming from the bank and moved closer, but one of the robbers spotted him and warned him not to come any closer or they would shoot the people inside. The police officer called for backup immediately. The scene then shifted to the police station, where one of the detectives, Detective Frazier, was talking to his girlfriend. She wanted to get married and move to a bigger apartment because her younger brother lived with them and was always giving Frazier a side eye. However, Detective Frazier had his own problem. He had been accused of stealing drugs, and if he didn't clear his name, it would be a serious issue. His boss arrived and told him about the robbery, assigning him to handle it. Although he wasn't thrilled, he agreed. This was his chance to get back in the game, or at least that's what his partner Mitchell said. Both of them then headed to the crime scene. The Manhattan Trust Bank was soon sealed off to keep other civilians away. A dozen people were gathered outside the bank, bombarding the cops with questions. Some journalists also arrived. The owner of the bank, Mr. Case, was informed by his secretary about the robbery at one of his branches. He was immediately frightened when he heard the name of the bank. Detective Frazier and Mitchell arrived at the crime scene and asked the cop who had alerted them to give a rundown of what had happened. The cop shared the little he knew. Back inside the bank, the robbers separated the staff from the customers and asked everyone to drop their phones and keys. Most people complied, but one man lied, saying he had left his phone at home. The robber, who seemed to be the leader, gave him a chance to tell the truth, but the man remained stubborn. The robber went through all the phones until he found one with the man's number. When he put it on speed dial, it rang inside the bank. The robber took the phone out of its hiding place and gave it back to the man. Though the man pretended not to be bothered, the robber took him to a separate room and beat him badly. The robber returned and asked if anyone else was hiding anything. The people who had been hiding their belongings quickly handed them over. A kid also had his phone with him and tried to give it to them, but the robbers told him to keep it. They then ordered everyone to strip down to their underwear. Everyone complied, except for an elderly woman who refused even after being threatened. The leader ordered one of the robbers to pull her aside, while the others were made to change into suits and masks. Meanwhile, Frazier visited the sergeants in charge. They asked him to inform them before taking any action, and they handed him a vest. Though the sergeants were not familiar with Frazier, he made it clear that he was in charge. The robbers changed into the same outfits they had given the hostages. One of the hostages was having a heart attack, and a robber helped him out. The cops quickly apprehended the robber because of the outfit. The old man told the cops that the robbers had threatened to throw 2 dead bodies out if the police got any closer to the bank. Mr. Case called a woman named Miss White and asked to meet with her. He had heard things about her and needed her help. Frazier and Mitchell investigated the old man they had apprehended. He told them everything he knew. There were 4 robbers in the bank, and they were dressed as painters. Mr. Case picked up Miss White, and they discussed the situation. He had an heirloom in his safety deposit box at the bank and wanted to keep its contents a secret from both the robbers and the authorities. Miss White said she didn't want to know what was in the box, but if it turned out to be something dangerous, like a nuclear missile, then the deal was off. Mr. Case assured her it wasn't anything like that. Miss White also mentioned that she couldn't do anything at the moment, especially with the robbers still in the bank. Besides, Mr. Case wasn't sure if the robbers were there for his heirloom. Miss White asked what would happen if it was exposed. Mr. Case explained that if the heirloom was found, he would be questioned, so it was better if it either wasn't found or disappeared. Miss White assured him she would handle it, as the person who recommended her certainly got his job done. Mitchell found the van the robbers had arrived in, and it looked like it had been stolen. The woman who had refused to strip had also been released and was brought in for questioning. She didn't seem to be a robber either. Miss White met with the mayor and, once they were in a private area, explained why she was there. She wanted him to give her access to the robbery. Though the mayor wasn't thrilled, he agreed. The robbers escorted a Sikh man outside with a suitcase hanging around his neck. The police couldn't do anything because guns were pointed at both the man and them. One of the cops mistook the Sikh for an Arab and asked if the suitcase contained a bomb. The Sikh man was aggravated but was cuffed and brought in for question. His turban had been removed when he was apprehended, so he refused to speak without it. Mitchell convinced him that his turban would be brought in. The Sikh man was a bank staff member and didn't understand why he was always suspected. He explained the situation of the robbery but wasn't sure about the number of hostages. Back at the bank, the robbers seemed to be digging something out. Fraser and the other cops opened the suitcase for the Sikh hostage. Inside, it stated that the robbers wanted a jet, or else they would start killing people in an hour. Fraser assured them they wouldn't be getting anything. Mr. Case arrived and acted strangely, even suggesting he should wait behind, but Fraser told him there was no need for that. The robbers then brought out another hostage at gunpoint. The hostage held a note saying they needed food for 50 people before the robbers went back inside. Fraser requested that the food they sent be taped with a listening device. So, they sent Pete. Fraser tried to talk to the leader, but the leader didn't answer or acknowledge him. One of the hostages took off his mask and started acting tough until the robbers found him and gave him a small beating. Meanwhile, the robbers continued digging into the floor for unknown reasons. The man who had the note was brought in for questioning. He explained that he didn't hear the robbers clearly because he had a hearing aid. Although Fraser had doubts and tried to get him to admit he was a robber, it was clear he wasn't. The robbers appeared to be shuffling something around. 2 more hostages were released and brought in for questioning. One of them remembered the faces of some of the other hostages, while the other, a woman, only remembered the face of the person who had removed his mask. The listening device picked up the robbers speaking a language that sounded Russian. They brought in a cop who spoke Russian, but he said the language wasn't Russian. Fraser went outside and had the listening device put on speakers for everyone to hear. He asked the spectators if they recognized the language. A construction worker raised his hand and was let through the barricade. The man said the language was Albanian. When asked if he could translate, he explained that he wasn't Albanian, but his ex-wife and her parents spoke the language all the time. He was certain it was Albanian. Fraser requested that the Albanian consulate be called and asked the man to wait around. Mitchell returned to tell Fraser that the van had no fingerprints. It had been stolen 2 days ago, but that was all they could find. The leader of the robbery crew, Dalton, found a kid eating a pizza slice and joined him. He noticed the video game the boy was playing was quite violent and promised he would discuss it with the boy's father. The cops had no luck with the Albanian consulate, so Fraser asked the construction worker to call his ex-wife. Despite his protests that he didn't like her, he agreed. When she arrived later, the first thing she handed to Fraser were her parking tickets, and then she started smoking. After listening to the device, she began laughing. It turned out to be a tape from the former Albanian president, talking about how Albanians were good people. They had been fooled. The mayor and Miss White arrived at the crime scene, and Fraser was called to their car. The mayor explained his request, and Miss White tried to use Fraser's alleged crime to convince him. Fraser called Dalton on the telephone, and surprisingly, he answered. They joked around for a bit before Dalton got straight to the point. He warned that if his demands were not met, people would start dying before hanging up. Miss White watched from a nearby location, while the cops stayed on guard as usual. The excavation at the bank continued. Another hostage was released, and after a few more fruitless investigations, Fraser decided to call Dalton again to ask for more time. Meanwhile, Fraser offered to send. Dalton gave them a trick question, and when they couldn't answer, he demanded sandwiches. It was late at night when Dalton called his girlfriend and told her about the situation. He might come home that night, but if not, they would meet when she had her shift in the morning. After ending the call, Dalton contacted Miss White, outlining the ground rules. He wasn't exactly threatening her, but the situation was certainly tense. Fraser called Dalton and handed the phone to Miss White. She vaguely expressed her interest, and Dalton invited her to come in. Miss White entered the bank alone and, after a thorough search by Dalton to ensure she had no weapons, they began to talk. Miss White explained that they could help Dalton, and would also offer him money. Dalton seemed to know why she was there, even though Miss White herself wasn't clear on all the details. He mentioned that during World War II, a certain man had sold out his people and used the proceeds to open a bank. Miss White was determined to only pick up the safety deposit box and leave, but Dalton already had it. Miss White wasn't sure how Dalton knew so much, but he was certain that if he ever faced a jury, Mr. Case and Miss White would help him get out of it. When Miss White asked how he planned to leave the bank, Dalton didn't hesitate to say that he would leave through the front door. Dalton didn't seem to be coming to terms with Miss White, so she was asked to leave the bank. Fraser requested a situation report, but Miss White remained as discreet as ever, and he didn't appreciate being made a fool twice. She only told him that the robber wasn't a murderer, and that she had made him an offer he was considering. After that, Miss White left, having nothing more to do. More hostages were released and were being investigated. The kid with the video game was also released with his father and answered some questions, but they still had no leads on who the actual criminals were. Frazier realized that the robbers might not be stalling time but that the situation itself was causing the delay. If the plane was what they wanted, he decided he would give it to them. Frazier called Dalton and asked to see the hostages before the plane was brought in. Dalton agreed, and Frazier entered the bank. After a few searches, Dalton gave him a tour of the rooms where the hostages were kept. On his way out, Frazier asked Dalton why he was stalling or if it was because he couldn't access the safety deposit box. Dalton's response was vague. Frazier then gave Dalton an ultimatum. He could either walk out the door with him, or Frazier's team would use gas and break through the windows. Frazier tried to outsmart Dalton and attacked him, but one of the other robbers came to Dalton's aid and pointed a gun at Frazier. This time, Dalton was more serious, demanding 2 buses and a plane. They kicked Frazier out. Frazier told Mitchell he was sure Dalton wasn't a murderer but was doing all this for something else. Despite having been pushed to the point where Dalton could have shot him, Dalton refrained from doing so. They set up an extra-tall viewing device towards the second floor, and to their shock, they saw one of the hostages being killed. The captain of the negotiation team that Detective Frazier worked for arrived at 3 a.m. after receiving the news of the hostage's death. Frazier was smart, but it was clear that a different approach was needed. The captain ordered the sergeant to take over the operation. The sergeants and their team began to strategize, but there was nothing they could do that would guarantee the safety of the hostages. Someone suggested using rubber bullets and dressing like painters, but Mitchell wasn't impressed with the idea. He feared that if anything went wrong, the blame would be pinned on Frazier. Frazier discussed his deal with the mayor, stating that he wouldn't let any of this affect. Frazier was talking to a cop when he realized something. The suitcase the robbers had brought contained a listening device. They had tricked them. He tried to alert the sergeant, but they were already on standby. Dalton warned his crew about the approaching cops, and they quickly threw tear gas and instructed all the hostages to exit the bank. Chaos erupted as everyone ran in all directions. The cops shot at some people, but fortunately, the guns were loaded with rubber bullets. Frazier, the sergeants, and other cops conducted a thorough search of the bank, but it was empty. Further investigation revealed toy guns and that the supposed shooting had been a fake execution. All the hostages were apprehended. Frazier explained to his captain how everything had been perfectly executed. The captain decided that since nothing was out of place, it was best to bury the case, but Frazier wasn't satisfied with that. He visited Miss White and played a recording of her and the mayor threatening him to gain access to the robbery site. Frazier pressed her about what she was helping Mr. Case to hide, but she gave a vague answer. After leaving Frazier, Miss White went to visit Mr. Case. She collected her check but not without telling him that he was one of the most wicked people she knew. The surprising part of it all was that the robbers had taken something else. The box didn't just contain evidence but also a diamond ring that had been taken from a French friend of Mr. Case, who had been convicted. The scene then shifted to Dalton explaining who he was, why he was doing the robbery, and how he managed to do it. Dalton was in the bank when Frazier walked in with a police permit to search a particular deposit box. Dalton's crew, stationed outside, alerted him, so he quickly did what he needed to do and left. He accidentally bumped into Frazier on his way out. When Dalton's crew asked him if he had returned the ring, he replied that the person they wanted to steal from was greedy and thought he could repay his evil deeds with a lifetime of good, but respect was worth more. Frazier found the ring in the safety deposit box, along with a note instructing him to follow the ring. He first confronted Mr. Case, whose shock at being caught was evident. Then Frazier went to the mayor and Miss White. The movie ended with Frazier recalling Dalton's statement from the robbery with a smile on his face. He seemed to have gained better recognition in this case.